Coming up on this week's show, a new Amiga system is coming next year.
Doom turns 30 and John Romero is making a new episode.
And we get the history of horror games with Dan Richardson.
And the Retro Hour podcast is, of course, brought to you every Friday with our wonderful friends at Bitmap Books. Now, of course, today on the show, we're going to be talking about horror video games. And if you love horror games, have you seen From Ants to Zombies, 6 Decades of Video Game Horror? The latest release from Bitmap Books. Now, from the 70s to the current day, from the ZX Spectrum to the Xbox Series X, it covers more than 130 horror games in over 600 beautifully illustrated pages. If you love the genre, you need to check this out. You can see it right now and order your copy at bitmapbooks.com. And with our lovely friends at PCBWay. Now, of course, you know about PCBWay. They offer fully featured custom PCB prototyping with low-cost, fast turnaround quality boards, and they offer services like 3D printing and injection molding. And you know they're massive supporters of the retro community. So if you're working on a project right now, get an instant quote at PCBWay.com. Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 403, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And very nice to be joining us for the podcast that every single Friday takes you on a nostalgic trip back, discusses classic video games, classic systems, explores the companies behind them, and of course brings you up to speed on what's been happening in the exciting world of retro from over the last 7 days. And I've got to say, obviously we just celebrated our 400th episode a couple of weeks ago. We're kind of in a bit of a celebratory mood as well this week because it is finally out there. The book.
Oh, you were so scared about clicking that button and sending it out. But it's been great to hear that people have kind of got a copy. And we've sent it out in the digital form in PDFs. Yeah. And, you know, when you back a book, it's always kind of better getting the hardback book. So we're getting a lot of people who are just skimming through it lightly at the moment. And I could totally understand that because I can't wait to actually hold it in my hands. But it is at the printers at the moment. So that time will be soon.
Yeah, no, for people that maybe haven't been long-term listeners, because it was about a year ago now, actually, pretty much, wasn't it, when we first set up the Kickstarter for the book? Feels longer ago than a year, weirdly. It's been a long old year, this. But it's been, pretty much a year of solid work on this book, featuring some of our favourite interviews. I'd say, there's a good probably 30% of the book's completely fresh stuff in there as well that no one's ever seen before. Loads of features in there. We've actually got 4 exclusive interviews. We only promised 3 of them originally, but I think it's just kind of one of these projects. It's just, as we've done it, has grown and grown and grown. I think the book's like, 439 pages?
Yeah, 400. It's definitely more than 400 pages. And I'd like to think it's more than 30%. That's new in there. There's quite a lot in there, and
on the pictures as well.
Yeah. And like Ravi says, people are kind of flicking through it, waiting for the physical book, which should be with us soon. Just seeing a picture of that and be able to hold it in the next couple of weeks, hopefully, would be absolutely amazing. But a lot of people, really, really praising the layout of it and stuff like that, and just kind of like the quality of it, which isn't necessarily down to us. That's down to our fantastic producer Simon, who has worked with us tirelessly.
He's done an amazing job.
He's done an amazing job.
Thanks so much, mate.
Yeah. And we're not exactly the easiest people to work with sometimes. So, yeah.
I know what you mean.
Yeah. So, it's been an experience this last year. But, celebrations all around for the last 3 or 4 weeks now. It's been amazing. Yeah,
because you sent the PDFs, the ebooks out on Sunday, wasn't it? And then went into the living room after I'd done it. My wife goes, "You're an author now?" I'm like, "Wow, yeah, I never thought of that. We've got a book out there. It's got like an ISBN number and everything." But if you did back it, thank you so much. And hopefully you've enjoyed the rewards that we sent out, and I've had a look at the ebook. And I know a lot of people, like you said, Ravi, are waiting for the actual hard book before they delve into it properly. But early feedback has been incredible. I don't think I've seen a single bad comment, fingers crossed, so far. So
you're asking for it now.
Yeah, bringing it on now. But, I mean, there have been people that have only joined the podcast in the last year. I've actually had a few messages of people going, can I get hold of a copy of the book? I missed out on the Kickstarter. We are going to have some left after all the backers have been fulfilled. So obviously I want to make sure that everyone's got their book who backed the Kickstarter first. And then, our patrons are going to get first dibs, I think, on the remaining stock that we've got, and then we'll open it up to everyone else. But also going to be selling the ebooks as well, aren't we, at some point? So there'll definitely be a way for everyone to get a look at the book very soon. So again, thank you for your support, and I hope you enjoyed it. Now, even though it was Halloween last week, Joe's still feeling in the spooky mood. You've been playing many horror games over the last couple
I'm always in the spooky mood, I am. Oh, God, what horror games? You know what? I've been playing the Wii with my daughter this week. I've been playing Cooking Mama, so that's pretty spooky, I guess, because it's terribly hard. But no, not really, actually. Cooking Mama. Actually, you know what? I've been playing The Mummy Demastered by Way Forward, which is a really good game if you haven't checked that out. It's a Metroidvania game. It's really, really fun. But the reason we are talking still about the spooky season 2 weeks on is this week's guest is actually a guy called Dan Richardson, and he is the developer producer behind TerrorBytes, which we actually spoke about in the news section a couple of weeks ago, which is a new upcoming docuseries by same guys who did like The Last Action Hero and what's it called, In Search of Darkness,
the FPS one, didn't they?
The FPS one, which we covered not too long ago. All fantastic documentaries that have all come out over the last couple of years. And they're doing another one called TerrorBytes, which is the evolution and history of, I was going to say of zombie games, but of horror games.
Including zombie games.
Including zombie games. There's a couple of standout zombie games in the history of horror games. And right up my street. Just, if you're into horror games and, Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and some, Japanese untouched kind of, unheard of games and stuff like that. Yeah, just the next kind of hour or so, just talking about that kind of stuff, deep dive into the history of it and the evolution of it. Yeah, absolutely just mind-blowing for me. Maybe some people find, Ravi, I know you're not big into your spooky games, I love it.
Not necessarily spooky. I'm into games that make you jump, and I think video games hit you differently than watching films and stuff, and it's kind of unique horror in the genre, the way that it's created with video games. So I think it's really interesting, though. It's a good subject to be talking about.
Yeah, and I think, we did cover this very briefly at the end of, I think it was the week before last, wasn't it, on the podcast? And then after we finished recording, Joe's like, wow, this looks really good. And I'm like, well, why don't we reach out, get them on? Like, Dan was well up for coming on, so we're going to have a full-on celebration of the history of horror games with this week's special guest, Dan Richardson. He'll be on the show in around 35 minutes from now. But of course, there is lots of news stories to get through. The first half of the podcast is when we bring you up to speed on what's been happening in the world of retro from over the last week. And so many people have tagged us in this on the socials and put it in our Discord as well. And everyone's very excited about this. The fact that we are getting a full-size new Amiga system. In the headlines I've seen everywhere, they're calling it a console. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But this one has got a full working keyboard.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not really that excited about this news because, we knew it was kind of coming. When we had the interview on the podcast with Retro Games Limited, they did mention that they would be going for that. Do
you want to go back and hear a bit of that? Because this is Chris Smith from Retro Games Limited, who we had on the podcast when the A500 Mini launched. And we did ask him that question, whether they were going to do a full-size Amiga, and also kind of what it was going to be like. So let's have a quick listen to that bit with Chris. Well, another question that I'm seeing everywhere, and a lot of people have been asking me this after my video, is... You obviously did the Maxi version of the 64 with the working keyboard. Any plans to do a Maxi A500 with a workable keyboard at some stage?
Yeah, it won't be an A500 because that would be a beast on the desk, really. So we'll probably choose a slimmer or a different form factor for it. It's harder to judge what the market would be for it. So as long as we can make it financially viable, as long as we're not making a loss on it, and there's enough to keep the company running towards the next product, it's something we'll definitely look at doing.
Yes, I mean, there's been a lot of speculation as to whether or not they do it. Like you said, Ravi, we did actually get the word from them last summer that this was always kind of the plan for it.
Yeah, and I think it's really cool, but at the moment it's just speculation, and as they release teasers and stuff, it's just going to go on and people are going to be like, has it got a floppy drive? Has it got this? What is it? I think the more interesting thing is the project line that they've kind of released, which says, they're launching another new mini console. Like, I really wonder what that is. They're also launching this full-size Amiga as well, but they're also launching another full-size console and another full-size console as well. So you've essentially got 3 new ones coming that, we've not heard anything about. And I'm just thinking, I wonder what they are and which companies they've done a deal with, because, you mentioned console here. They're kind of using the term console for the Amiga, which, I call a computer, but maybe these other ones are. I don't know. We're speculating with some people on Discord and saying maybe it could be, Atari, ST, Jaguar, or Lynx or something. I'm not quite sure who they've done a deal with,
Just to kind of set up what this is, I mean, this is Retro Games Limited, who were the company that brought the A500 Mini out last year, which was a mini consoleized version of the Amiga that had, a nice launcher screen in there, a load of built-in games. Previously, before that, they did the C64 and the VIC-20 Mini as well, didn't they? And also a full-size version of the Commodore 64 Maxi as well. And like you said, this week they've released their product roadmap, which is basically a look at what they're going to be doing until the end of 2025. So it's kind of their product lineup for the next 18 months or so. So what did you think of this, Joe? Because I know you've played with my A500 Mini.
Yeah, I think this is cool. Obviously for the Amiga fans and the classic kind of computer fans. I think just kind of reflecting on what Ravi said there about how they're calling it a full-size Amiga console launch and a full-size console launch, etc. Mini console launch. I think that's for marketing purposes more than anything, because I think it alienates it if they put it as a mini computer or a Amiga computer launch, because of the likes of myself, maybe some people who weren't necessarily into the Amigas and the Commodores and stuff back in the day. I think by calling it a computer, by calling it a console, they feel it's more accessible now. Does that make sense?
But also they're using the word Amiga now.
Yeah.
When before it was the A500 Mini. Yeah. And I know they had licensing from Cloanto. But
New full-size A console launched.
Yeah. So I'd think they would put A500 Mini, A500 full-size rather than full-size Amiga. So they might have all the branding on it and stuff.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Which, you mentioned there kind of, what their products will be going forward, whether they're going to be doing Atari STs or whatever. It's interesting that all of their releases so far have been Commodore machines, haven't they?
That's what I mean. And I think it shows that they're kind of into that area of computers and the kind of retro scene, and I'm just thinking, being based in the UK as well, are they kind of going for this this vibe? Could they be a BBC Micro? Could there be a Vectrex or something that we've not seen in a mini form before?
Yeah, I was thinking if they stick with the Commodore kind of products, there's not really many more to do. I can't imagine them doing a Commodore PET Mini or Maxi or a Plus 4. I can't imagine that'd sell very well. It's going to be interesting seeing going forward what they do. I think you might be right. Maybe the Atari ST would be a good contender, because it does seem like a system that doesn't really get much in the way of new products being released.
Yeah, or even a little Lynx. Or just a full-size Lynx would still be little, of course, wouldn't it? Like a mini Lynx would be tiny.
So it'll be interesting to see going forward what they do. In terms of this full-size Amiga then, it's interesting that, again, a lot of people have been saying, is it going to be basically a big Amiga 500? We heard from Chris there a year ago that wasn't their plan, because, he did talk this kind of off-air afterwards as well, about the fact that, there's so much plastic involved in making a clone of the original.
They're giant, actually. A500, you look at them.
And you think about the size of the circuit board in there, it's pretty much a bit bigger than a Raspberry Pi. So it'd be rattling around the case, wouldn't it, if it was to be a full-size Amiga 500. But then I'm thinking, what else could it be, though? I mean, it could be something completely new. Some people have said they're going to make CD32s, replicas.
To be honest, I've heard lots of people say CD32s, and I don't think it garners the kind of public attention as much as the A500 did. The A500 was a lot more well known, and even stuff like the A600, people just don't associate it, with Amiga. In the mainstream, the A500 was the biggest selling one, so I think it's probably going to be that. But in a reduced form.
Yeah.
Yeah, just
That was my thinking too, that maybe it'll be like a size of an Amiga 600, but with that kind of more of a form factor of the A500. So it looks more like basically a bigger version of the A500.
Yeah, somewhere in between, Yeah.
Yeah. Which I think is cool. I mean, it's, again, like you said, Joe, they tend to aim these more at the console market. It's really for games players, isn't it? But, I mean, I've been playing with my A500 Mini recently, and kind of the modding community have really taken that to the next level now. I mean, we talked about those, this kind of workbench packs, so you can run, the Amiga OS on there and load up Deluxe Paint and stuff like that as well. Recently, people have even got Wi-Fi working on it, so you can connect it to the internet and web browse on it using Amiga web browsers and download stuff from Aminet and FTP servers and stuff as well.
I wonder,
really, I mean,
when are we going to run out of mini consoles to create? That's the question nowadays.
We know we're scraping the barrel, as you said, when the CD32 Mini comes out.
Yeah, they might just go, that might be a CD TV Mini.
Oh.
Who knows? Yeah. I doubt it.
For Dan to buy and about 4 other people. Yeah.
We sold 2.
So, I mean, it is very exciting to see that they are doing that, I think, Because, I mean, not for us guys like me and you, Ravi, who've got, a load of original Amiga machines as well. But I think actually being able to walk in and get, a new Amiga with a working keyboard that actually is functional as one, in 2024, 25 is going to be exciting, I think. So if you want to check out their roadmap and speculate as to what else they're going to be doing, because, like you said, there is quite a lot of product announcements they're going to be doing over the next 18 months or so. So you can check out the roadmap right now. And what we know so far, we'll stick that in our show notes this week as well. Now, something else is celebrating a big anniversary. It feels like everything that we played growing up as kids is like, suddenly turning 25 or 30 recently. But Doom is going to be celebrating its 30th birthday next month on December the 10th. I still remember at school, 'cause I had an Amiga then, 1993, before I got my A1200, I think, actually. And I remember a kid in the library kind of going, he had like the shareware demo of Doom. And I remember him being really excited about it and telling me about it. And I thought he was on about the game Dune. At first, he kept saying, have you played Dune? Have you played Dune? I'm like, Dune? Yeah, I played that years ago. Obviously, he was talking about this incredible new FPS game, and I've told the story before how I first got my eyes on it when I went into Ryman the Stationers, which seemed to be the place to go for, upcoming hot games when I was a kid. But that game is celebrating its 30th birthday, and if you're talking about, games that really defined a genre, Doom is up there, isn't it? And some of the biggest video games of all time, and a series that continues to this day. And of course, a few years ago, we did get John Romero doing a pack called Sigil, which was basically some new episodes for the original Doom that he released for the 25th anniversary. But now he's going to be doing a follow-up, Sigil 2, to celebrate Doom's 30th.
Yeah, I mean, I love Doom, but I'm not into the whole kind of like, I play Doom on like my Xbox One, We're like probably a little bit of a heathen there.
I've got a feeling, didn't Bethesda actually put the Sigil pack out for the Xbox, didn't they?
I think they did actually, because I do feel like there was 5 episodes on there and I did play through them all, but I couldn't tell you what they all are kind of thing. But yeah, this is coming out on the 30th anniversary, which is going to be December 10th. And it is going to be free to download, and it comes with 9 levels along with 2 deathmatch only levels as well, which is quite interesting. He did do you can pay for it, a digital edition. And then you could also do a physical edition where it just comes on a USB stick. It comes on a nifty little shotgun shell. The physical edition on a USB stick, so it's a little shotgun shell. But that instantly sold out, like as soon as it was announced. All right. The physical edition gone straight away, which I am not surprised with it being Doom, with it being so huge. But 30, man, like that's. Yeah. I mean, I'm starting to feel. When we first started this, like I was in my mid-20s. Now I'm in my mid-30s, and I'm like, oh god, these games are turning 30 and stuff, and I'm feeling old. But
he's
the hairs are going grey and the knees are hurting.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's going to do a live Twitch chat with John Carmack as well.
Oh, awesome.
Which is going to be on the day of release as well, which, 10th of December. And I think that will probably break Twitch.
Yeah, probably.
And that's moderated by our good buddy David L. Craddock. He's going to be hosting that on Twitch. So, yeah, I think that's awesome. I mean, the fact that John Romero, I remember, like you said about the fact how long we've done this podcast now. I remember us talking about the first Sigil pack. Probably feels like about a year or two back.
And he's a great level designer as well. That's why these, why these episodes are so fantastic, and having the add-ons on Doom,
Yeah, so the fact that, we're now getting the, unofficial Doom 6th episode, I love the fact that he gives them away for free as well.
Yeah.
It just proves the love he's still got for Doom all these years on. And seeing, John Romero going back to making levels for the original Doom, and it works on, obviously, Ultimate Doom as well. And yeah, I mean, that's going to be a must download when that comes out. So not long to wait, just over a month, coming out on December the 10th. So if you want to check that out, I'll put that in our show notes as well. Now, we have got something very cool to talk about in a moment. The world's first dog speedrunner in a video game in just a minute. And an incredible new cassette emulator that works on lots of retro machines. So we'll talk about all that in just a sec. Before we do, let's just take a quick second to give a big thank you to this week's sponsor. It is, of course, one of our longest running sponsors, our incredible friends at ExpressVPN. Now, we know at the moment the economy is, really difficult. I renewed my mortgage the other day, and that's going to buy about £300 a month. You guys know I've been crying over that since the weekend as well. And we're thinking of all the streaming services as well. I mean, my missus signs up to all. We've obviously got Netflix. She, Prime's on there as well. Disney Plus. Got some weird stuff I've never heard of. Stars Play. What the hell is Stars Play? My missus signs up to
I've cut down on my subscriptions. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, they're just getting so expensive now as well. And the thing is, the price of them keeps going up all the time too. Now, one good thing about ExpressVPN is you can cut back and save a lot of money as well. Because did you know that actually services like Netflix have got thousands more shows than you think? But the reason is that they're only licensed to play them in certain countries. So, for example, if you open Netflix on your TV in the UK, it's going to be completely different from what someone in Italy or Japan or America sees. But using ExpressVPN, you can change your online location, and ExpressVPN's got over 90 countries to choose from. So when you run out of stuff to watch, rather than having 1,000 different services that you pay for, you just have one and switch to another country and unlock thousands of new shows as well. Now, for example, we've been watching on the American Netflix recently, Ravi. It seems like you're always on that.
Yeah, I've been watching The Matrix, but also, for Guy Fawkes Night, I watched V for Vendetta, which is a absolutely fantastic one and not available on the UK Netflix. So, it's a great service, ExpressVPN, and it's incredibly fast. I leave it on sometimes and I don't realise.
Yeah, and you don't get any buffering, anything like that.
Nope.
Really, really quick. And on top of that, you can even use ExpressVPN to get discounts as well. Like, did you know that, for example, if you buy Netflix from Argentina, it costs a fraction of the price? There's a little tip there as well. Now, it works out less than $7 a month as well. ExpressVPN completely pays for itself and a lot more as well. So a no-brainer. If you want to give it a try, get access to a load more shows, and, of course, use our exclusive link so we get the credit. They know that we sent you. Head to expressvpn.com/retro, and you get 3 extra months on a 1-year plan. So we'll sort you out with 3 months for free. expressvpn.com/retro, and a big thank you to our mates at ExpressVPN for their continued support. Do you guys ever watch speed runs on Twitch or YouTube? Another very big genre these days.
Yeah, I watch quite a lot of speed runs on horror games, Resident Evil, stuff like that. And I think I'm quite fast at these games, and I watch these speed runs and I feel quite pathetic. But not as pathetic as I feel after watching this one.
Well, this is the world's first dog who's going to become a speedrunner, an event that's coming up next year called AGDQ 2024. Now, this is an event that's held in Pittsburgh, and they stream this as well. And basically, it's called Games Done Quick. Awesome Games Done Quick, it stands for. And they do this event and stream them as well to raise money for charity. But this year, for the very first time, a competitor called Peanut Butter is going to be taking part, and he's a dog.
He's the Doge dog. Well, he's not the Doge dog. But
It looks very similar, actually.
Yeah, but he's is it a Shibu? Is it called?
Shiba.
Yeah, Shimbu Inu, or I can't remember.
He's pretty good at Gyromite for the original NES. And it's interesting how they set it up. He's got a custom controller to open so with the original Gyromite, which I think you played with Rob the Robot, didn't you?
In 2-player mode, you can play with Rob,
in 2-player mode. You essentially pressed the buttons to open gates and pipes, like red or blue ones. And I'm assuming he's following his owner's commands.
Yeah, so the owner's kind of tempting him with the hands. So it's actually the owner speedrunning, and the dog's just pressing it.
Have a listen to it. Here he is.
Good boy, are you ready? Are you ready? Watch me. Button. Wait, oh no, sit. Here you go, buddy. There, let's try that again. This time for sure. Button. Sit. Whatever, that's good enough. All right, good boy.
So yeah, there's a 25-minute video of him training it that you can watch on YouTube.
Yeah, I think, maybe a dog that's had more practice would be better. Or a cat. You see those videos of cats ringing those bells for a snack. That was going to work.
That was going to be my question. Do you guys, see your cat or your dog doing this? You think you could train
if there's food, they'd do anything. Food involved at the end or a reward. Yeah.
I do love my dog. He's not the smartest dog I've ever owned. He's in the room, so I've got to be quiet. I don't think... I don't fancy his chances of something like Cuphead or Battletoads. If
it was sniffing, there's dogs that sniff out bombs and stuff like that. They're really good at that. And if you had that as a kind of control device, yeah.
So, I do think it is awesome. Like you said, it's really the owner kind of instructing him when to put his paw down on this pedal, really, isn't it? But I think in terms of novelty, the fact that this is the first canine speedrunner in the world that we know of, and the fact this is for a charity stream as well, I think, it's a bit of a giggle,
it's good for a headline.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want to check out that little training video, it's very cute to watch. I'll put that in our show notes as well. Now, I must admit, I don't really use cassette tapes much anymore, even on my my retro systems that are of that era. I'm thinking of like my Commodore 64 and my Commodore Plus 4, generally use an SD2 IEC SD reader on those. And you guys know that my Spectrum Next should be arriving any day now as well. I have actually got some more Spectrum games on cassette tape from the 10 minutes that I owned a Spectrum back in the 90s. I've told you guys about this before when I accidentally plugged in my Canon printer power supply into it and blew it up. So that was my 10 minutes. I've been waiting 30 years now to play these Spectrum games. Looking forward to my next arriving as well. But for those of us who maybe, there's an article here on Time Extension that I put in our show notes as well. They kind of say that cassette tapes are coming towards the end of their lifespan now, which I don't know. I'm a little bit doubtful about that because I've still got audio cassettes that work fine. If anything, I think they're probably more reliable than floppy disks.
Yeah, I've still got loads of blanks at home and they're fine. And, I still see them on sale in the shops. Some of the hipster kind of record shops have a few cassettes in the corner.
Yeah, they seem to be really coming back. I was in a charity shop over the weekend, and it seems quite a few charity shops now as well have audio books on cassette tape and albums. Definitely seems to be a medium that's had a comeback in recent years. But obviously if you own a lot of kind of old school games for your Amstrad or your Spectrum, you might not want to get the original tapes out the box too often because they are becoming rare now, and obviously we all know that cassette tapes have a problem insofar as they can get chewed up by the mechanism. And if your favourite game from back in the day got chewed up, I imagine you wouldn't be all that happy. But there is now a great little solution that doesn't actually require any additional hardware for your machine itself, called the TZX cassette, and this is a universal cassette emulator that works on for example, the Commodore 64, the Spectrum, and the BBC Micro. They've tested it with as well, but it could work on even more machines potentially. What do you guys think?
It's that technology that basically, when you had a rubbish car stereo and you put a cassette in that had a jack lead coming from it, and then you connected your mini disc or CD player to it, and suddenly, you could play tunes on the old radio. It's kind of using that so it connects with the tape heads. This is obviously a solution for people that want to use like the original cassette player on a device, like rather than something like an SD plug-in or a kind of replacement that does it. So it's very niche, but I think it's got a lot more applications as well. I guess you could put music on this. Maybe if they had a wireless trip in there, stream music to it. It could develop as something that you could, put in old cars and then straight away Bluetooth connect to it and go for it. I like the idea that it's got a battery in there. It's got a little OLED display as well and buttons to select the tracks. It's just a really cool little concept, and I'm surprised nobody's actually done it before. And I'd love to see how this develops. I think it's got a lot more legs than just in the kind of retro gaming world, but it does feel that solution for people that want to use that cassette drive. Like, I can imagine something like the Amstrad that had the built-in cassette drive on the later models. That could be really useful. Or like, there was some Commodore PETs that actually had cassette drives as well.
They did, Yeah, and I think, I do like this solution. There have been similar things in the past. You can actually buy from like Argos and things, but it's nowhere near as advanced as this. I got one that's basically, it looks like the shell of a cassette, but it's got like an SD card slot on the top. So you put an SD card in there, and you can basically load on WAV files, audio files onto it, or MP3s.
Yeah.
I tried it on my Commodore Plus 4 and 64. Didn't read them at all. Couldn't get it working. So that wasn't a solution for games as far as I could see, but it would work with, putting MP3s onto an old cassette player in your car, for example. But this one, it's much more fully featured than that. This actually is based on an Arduino, and it's by someone on X or Twitter called Real Jam Hamster. And it is quite advanced. I mean, you've got an SD card reader in there as well. Like you said, there's an OLED screen on there too. So obviously you can see kind of what game is selected from the SD card. You've got the Arduino controlling everything.
A USB charger as well, it seems to have, and a battery.
Yeah, there's a built-in battery that looks like, kind of a generic iPod-style battery, which, like you said, you can charge from USB. You've got some LEDs in here as well. The example he's made is quite a cool-looking turquoise green cassette shell, which I think gives it a nice look. And he's even got stuff like motor pause detection working on it as well. Because, some systems kind of, particularly I remember on the Commodore 64, you may have multi-load games where they kind of load a level into RAM. I think I remember International Karate doing this. And when you got to the next level, the game would basically load the next level from the cassette tape. So, for stuff like that, it means the system can automatically kind of pause the tape without you having to manually do it. Which is very cool. And he's actually made a bunch of these as well. So basically he's using the kind of rejected tapes, the shells of old cassette tapes to build these in as well. No word on whether he's going to be releasing these commercially or anything at the moment, but I think it does look like a product that if he releases plans for it, then people could get these working themselves. And I know, like you said, there is SD card readers and all that, but actually one thing I really like about using kind of tape images on old 8-bit machines is you get the full experience. For example, some Spectrum games give you like a loading screen when it was loading from the tape that would, procedurally draw on the screen. Generally, if you're loading them from like disk images, you don't get all of that. And even stuff like Cracktros and all that as well. And even hearing the sound of the game loading on a Spectrum, authentically like you did the original tapes, I think is very cool. So I think for those that kind of want that as close as possible to the original cassette tape experience, then this is going to be a really good solution, isn't it? So, not much more to say in this really, but I think there's definitely a market for it too. So, like you said, Ravi, it could be something that's even bigger like the audio crowd as well.
I think it's got a lot of legs, and obviously they've thought about it well. And, if you can save a cassette that has been ruined otherwise and actually play the title or, preserve one, then this is great.
I've been walking around with my cassette Walkman over the last couple of weeks.
What, those little foam earphones that you use?
No. I plugged some iPhone, iPod ones into it. I think they are actually. But the reason I've been doing it is because, of course, we did recently do our own audio cassette, didn't we?
Yeah, I thought you were like making a mixtape for your wife or something.
I really want to now.
I just thought you were being a hipster.
Probably not for the wife, yeah. I've been walking around though because I thought, well, because for those that didn't know, we actually did a special episode of the podcast for our Kickstarter backers on the book, didn't we?
Yeah.
On the top tier. And when we first did it, we thought, we might get maybe 5-6 people back that. And I'll just buy a tape-to-tape copy and we'll do it. I think we had about 175 or something, didn't we?
Yeah.
Quite a lot.
Yeah, it was quite a few.
People back that too, So we had to actually find a cassette duplicator in 2023, which luckily they do still exist. So, I've been walking around, obviously I had to kind of check it, make sure that it played properly, fished out my old cassette player, my old, is it Sony Walkman from like 2000? So I've been walking around my village kind of in Costa and that with my... with my cassette player, listening to our book.
Well,
so,
that's that's the killer product I've just thought of now. So you get Spotify, you connect it up with a Bluetooth wireless chip, and then you make custom playlists for girls and or boys, you love us, and then you go, I've made you a mixtape, and you hand it 80s style, but you're streaming them, and you can change your. And then adverts pop up halfway through, and you go, he's too cheap to get premium.
Obviously, it relies on having a cassette tape player as well, Ravi. But, I like your plan.
Yeah.
So if you want to check that out, so far it is a work in progress. Looks like he's finally finished it for himself. Hopefully there'll be a way for other people to get their hands on these. I'll put that video by Real Jam Hamster in the show notes this week as well. Now, it seems that only the other week we were talking about something similar to this. It's because we were talking about Mortal Kombat 2 getting ported to the 3DO last month, if you guys remember. Not to be outdone by the 3DO, the Atari Jaguar is now getting what looks to be a pretty arcade perfect of the original first Mortal Kombat game.
You know what? I always have to kind of go back and check. Whenever I see anything about Mortal Kombat getting ported to the Jag, or, when we were talking about Mortal Kombat being on the 3DO and stuff the other week, I always go and check, and I'm like, was it not on the Jag? Because Mortal Kombat was on everything. Like it was.
I think it was promised initially, but it never came out.
Yeah, but it never actually came out, did it? But yeah, it seems like an obvious console for it to be on. Because you got that.
If people bought it.
Yeah, well, yeah. But it's just like the Jaguar seemed perfect for it. You know, what was that? Is it Kasumi Ninja by Naughty Dog? Yeah. Which was a rip-off of Mortal Kombat on the Jag. But yeah, it just always surprises me not that it wasn't on there. But yeah, this does look really nice. This is they started making this in February this year. And they've been working on this for some time using a development kit called Jag Studio, I believe it is.
Which I'll talk more about in a minute, because that's very impressive.
Yeah, to get this running. But it does look really impressive. And the video, it's about 25 minutes long, but there's a lot of focus in there about kind of like frame rates and frames of animations on the... Because you don't really think about this, but it's like the frames of animation on the character sprites, like just when they're standing there, you think Mortal Kombat, they kind of like, you know, they kind of jig side to side, don't they? Like ready to fight. And it's like so many of the console ports and stuff, you lose frames of that animation when they're ported from the arcade to the consoles. Whereas this Jag version, you know, they're trying to keep it all kind of like arcade perfect, or, you know, as perfect as possible. And, you know, it does look really good. It's quite funny. I've got it, the video, you know, paused right now on the character select screen, and because of the hyper detail of it, because it does look more detailed, you can actually see the goofy face expressions on some of the characters
on the select screen.
Yeah. So, but yeah, no, it looks really impressive.
Yeah, now this is a guy called True Fun Games, and he's put there's a couple of videos on his YouTube channel. Like he said, originally he started this beginning of the year. It was a bit of a proof of concept, really. And then a lot of people kind of, that looks really, you know, should do that. So he said, well, why not? So now he's actually making, using the arcade assets as well, basically what it looks like is going to be a proper, true arcade version of Mortal Kombat for the Atari Jaguar. Now, at the moment, he's got the title screen that he's changed a little bit. From the arcade one, you've got the character select screen as well, which again looks pretty much identical to the arcade. The only difference is, you know, you get the characters like left and right, who you pick your fighter.
Yeah.
On the arcade's got more resolution, so they're a bit further down the screen, but he's moved them up and actually kind of overlap the characters with the tiles behind it with the other character selects things, which I think actually looks really good. It's a nice little effect that he's put on there. And then you get into the game itself, and yeah, I mean, this has got it all. Even stuff like, you know, there's a little kind of flame in the first level that kind of flickers, you know, in the arcade version. I remember like the Mega Drive version didn't have that in, or the Amiga one, it was just static, it didn't move. And it's actually got like, there's like 3-layer parallax scrolling in here as well.
Yeah, with the clouds.
The level of detail.
Yeah, the clouds and everything in the background. It is the frame rate that's doing it for me. Like, you forget how detailed these games were, you know, because in my mind's eye, I'm so used to playing it on like the Mega Drive or on the Super Nintendo. And when you look, you know, when you look back and actually kind of like look at the arcade comparison, you know, in this video, you forget how much detail was actually in this game. You know, and it's crazy. Like you say, the flame, the parallax scrolling behind the big Japanese pagoda building and stuff like that. Like, it does look amazing, and I know the Jag's a failed console, but it's like, oh, look at what you could have had.
Yeah, 100%. It proves that kind of, if people used it, you know, the hardware properly, then, you know, there were some really impressive things that were capable on it. I mean, it's less colours in the arcade. I think the arcade version, it said had 64 colours.
It's got 16.
And he's down, but I mean, it doesn't look like it. He's done a really good job of kind of, you know, remapping the colour palettes of them. And yeah, he's used this environment called Jag Studio, which I had heard the name before, but then I did a bit of digging kind of to find out a bit more about what it is. Because there was basically a development suite for the Jaguar called Raptor API a few years ago, which was actually the package that he started developing this in, but you've got to use assembly code for that. And he said he's not really an assembly programmer.
Right.
So that was slowing him down. And his day job is that he programs in C. So using Jag Studio, that's actually a really advanced development suite for the Jaguar, and you can use assembler, basic, or C. And then really what it will do is it's got hardware abstraction layers in there as well, plug in modules. So really it means that you can take advantage of the Jaguar's chipset without having to do your own routines and, you know, figure it all out yourself. So it really does mean that, you know, in just a few weeks, people are making really impressive games, you know, using this. It would have took months back in the day. What do you think, is Revy?
Yeah, I think it's good. Some of the home ports were kind of lacking. I'm impressed. And you're right with the Jag system. It needs more kind of development and more time putting into it. And I found that was a problem with a lot of the systems back then. You know, they failed and people didn't put that time and effort into porting stuff. They were quick ports and they didn't take advantage of the hardware. So it's always nice to see, you know, a title living up to the actual hardware that it's on.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, Joe, you were shocked that Mortal Kombat didn't come out in the Jaguar. Even Rise of the Robots didn't come out in the Atari Jaguar.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so
poor Jag.
Didn't get much love. Yeah. I think it swerved a bullet there. But this homebrew version of Mortal Kombat looks really good, so hopefully it won't be too long until we get to play that, and I'm sure he'll put it up for free, you know, because obviously I wouldn't imagine he'd want to sell this and get in trouble. But hopefully it will be something you can download and play on your, because obviously the Atari flash carts are out there now for, you know, the Jaguar. You can play it on those, hopefully. So it looks very good. Keep up the good work, and if you want to check out that work in progress, and of course the rest of the stories, you don't have to Google around, that's save you the job. Just head to our website, theretrohour.com, or check out the show notes in your podcast app. Right, in just a moment, going to get the history of horror games with this week's very special guest, Dan Richardson. Before we do that, let's take a quick second to give a big thank you to another one of our sponsors this week, and it is our wonderful mates at Notion. Now, you've heard us talking about Notion before, the fact that, you know, we have this struggle, Joe, don't we, in our jobs, all these different services that we have to open, Teams, Trello, Discord. How many do you have to open when you go into work every day?
I can't go into them in too much detail due to my job, but it's at least about 15. And then I have about at least 4 or 5 OneNotes open as well at work, and it's just absolutely crazy. And it's like I've got 3 screens open, whereas at home, you know, where I'm on my home computer and everything, I am allowed to use Notion. It's very similar to OneNote, but you can have so much more in there, and I'm a simpleton, and you can make it as simple as you want or as complex as you want, can't you?
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, you need to tell your boss to get on this, because not only has it got all that, you know, time-saving features and, you know, less alerts and all the things that annoy us, notifications going off on all these different services. But one incredible thing about Notion is something called Notion Q&A. Now, obviously, at the moment, the biggest thing in the world is artificial intelligence, and they've implemented this so well. I mean, like you said, it combines your notes, your docs, all your projects together in one very simple-to-use workspace. And they've got a new feature in there called Q&A, which is basically an AI assistant that can answer questions about, for example, your next quarter's roadmap. Maybe you've got a marketing campaign proposal you're looking for. Maybe you want to find out, you know, a long-lost link that you know is in one of your documents somewhere on your shared drive, or one of your colleagues has sent you in a message maybe 6 months ago. You ask it to find it for you. It'll do it in seconds. It is that easy. So that urgent piece of information that previously you have to spend probably hours looking for, it'll find it really quickly, and most importantly, keep your sanity intact as well. So all you do is ask Q&A to find it for you. And obviously, when your projects are getting more complex as well, and you want to find stuff across your entire company, this is where it comes in. It can make use of your entire database of knowledge to make sure that the answers are actually really helpful as well. So it could be like, you know, your wiki, your project, your docs, your meeting notes as well. And normally you might turn to a coworker to ask it something like, you know, when did you send me that message? Have you got a link to this? Ask your Q&A. It'll search through thousands of documents in just seconds, thousands of messages as well. Answer it in a clear language, no matter how large or complex your workspace is as well. So you can find exactly what you need without having to leave your dock and go hunting through thousands of files. And you can trust that your data is secure, because Notion AI is designed to protect your information. No AI models are trained with your information. It's all encrypted, and answers will never use information from pages that you haven't got access to as well. So it really means you can get on with your work, and it will save you so much time. So why don't you give this a try? Honestly, doesn't it sound like a game changer? Have a look. Notion AI. Try it for free by going to notion.com/retrohour. All lowercase, notion.com/retrohour to try the powerful, easy-to-use Notion AI today. And of course, use our link, support the podcast, notion.com/retrohour. And a massive thank you to our friends at Notion for their support of our show. Right, then next, let's get into the history of horror video games with our special guest, Dan Richardson. He's next on the Retro Hour podcast. You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and it's time to welcome on this week's very special guest. And I can already hear Joe completely getting into his element here. We're going to be talking about horror video games, and you might have heard us talking about this incredible new documentary a couple of weeks ago on the podcast, which is called TerrorBytes, The Evolution of horror gaming. That's part of the In Search of Darkness series. Now, obviously you know that Creative VC, you've probably heard us talking about them before, also did that incredible first-person shooter documentary, Last Action Heroes, and In Search of Darkness, which started as a journey into iconic 80s horror movie, now going into games as well, you know, that really, really do these nostalgic documentaries so well. And we thought we'd welcome on the producer on this new TerrorBytes movie, Dan Richardson. How you doing, Dan?
I am doing fantastic and very glad to be here. Hello, everybody.
Well, nice to have you on, mate. And I know Halloween was a couple of weeks ago, but I think we can keep the spooky vibe going a little bit longer because this new TerrorBytes documentary just looks incredible. I mean, you know, so we can kind of get to know you a little bit, Dan. I mean, kind of, you know, what's your background with gaming? Where did your journey with video games begin?
Oh, I mean, I've been playing games since probably I was too young to talk. There is literally a home video of me playing Alex Kidd in the Miracle World on the Master System at my nana's house. The filming is, and it's like, oh, look, the baby's playing the games, and, you know, they're kind of joking along. And then my older brother goes like, no, hang on, look, he's doing it. And I'm very slowly making my way through the first level. My background professionally has more been in filmmaking, but my passion has always been video games. You know, I am somebody who proudly wears a massive Legend of Zelda tattoo on their back, and Undertale tattoos on my arm, and little references here and there, literally all over my skin. So yeah, I've just always deeply into games, and in a way that sort of doesn't necessarily give away my age as well. Growing up, I was always a couple of generations behind whatever was new at the time. So as a result, I've kind of got a lot of fond memories of the NES and the Super Nintendo, despite being sort of born well into the Super Nintendo's life cycle. But yeah, it's been a huge passion for us, and biggest passion at the moment for me, and something that's cultivated over years within games, is obviously horror games. And so it's really thrilling to be kind of making a documentary and really spotlighting that subgenre of a medium that I love so much.
So yeah, tell us about, so you mentioned there your kind of like your 9 to 5 is in filmmaking, and you work for Creator VC, who is behind TerrorBytes. Kind of tell us about what you do there and what your job is there, and then we'll get into the nitty gritty of the horror games. Yeah,
so Creator VC, if you don't know, are this independent studio created by Robin Block. We've basically cultivated this niche in that we do these really grand scale retrospective documentaries on specific niches within pop culture. But we don't just do them where we'll sort of point at things and say like, hey, remember this? We actively involve the people who have created those materials on a huge scale that, like, I don't want to own horn here, but I think that nobody else is really doing at the minute. So what we'll kind of do is, you know, to give you an example of what other gaming documentary with FPS Doc, we went through this big, long journey. It's a 5-hour long documentary, you know, huge scale stuff, going from the very, very, very early days of the first person shooter all the way up to the present day. And along the way, you know, we're interviewing all of these key figures like Warren Spector and having him talk about System Shock, and John Romero and John Carmack and having them talk about Doom. And we're just building this, you know, huge portrait of such a like important subsection of the medium. And where I sort of came into with TerrorBytes is I had a couple of independent films, fiction films that were doing fairly well in like film festivals and stuff. And on a personal YouTube account, I actually, just as a sort of fun side hobby thing, I do a lot of horror analysis. I've just come off the back of a massive 31-day video essay marathon I always do for October for Halloween, where I do a specific video essay on a specific film each and every day of the month.
Oh, wow. What's the YouTube channel called?
As a skeleton. Dan Drambles.
Dan Drambles. Okay, I'll link that up in the show notes.
And I do it all well dressed as a skeleton.
Nice.
And I did that. I did that for charity this year, and that was the finishing one. So I met Robin, who runs Creator VC, sort of through both of these ventures. Actually, kind of, we got in contact about some other project that unfortunately I can't talk about. But while we were having these conversations, you know, we kind of looked at my filmmaking past, and, you know, he kind of come across my YouTube, that kind of came up, and he looked at horror analysis and stuff, and he was like, oh, wow, you've like really got a knack for this. And so as our relationship developed, what that ended up essentially becoming right now is TerrorBytes. And that's kind of how this whole journey started.
Well, talking about your personal history with horror games, I mean, I've still got vivid memories of, you know, playing games like, you know, Alone in the Dark when I was a kid, and just, you know, Joe's a massive fan of the Resident Evil series. I don't think an episode of this podcast goes by that Joe hasn't mentioned Resident Evil every episode for 8 years.
I don't think a day goes by. It's in my life.
What about you, Dan? I mean, what's kind of the first horror game you kind of really fell in love with?
Oh, I mean, probably, I know it's the generic answer, especially since we've just named it, but probably Resident Evil as well. My relationship with horror in general has always been one of almost the taboo. Like, I very much wasn't allowed to play this stuff when I was younger, but that made it all the more enticing and all the more interesting. I've got this very vivid memory of being on a holiday, and my mom bought me like a gaming magazine to read for the long car ride. I think it was like a PlayStation magazine or something. And one of the featured reviews in that magazine was Nightmare Creatures. I don't know if you guys remember that game, PS1. Yeah. And it didn't even have screenshots of the violence. It vaguely alluded to a violent scene that occurred in the game while I was sort of reviewing it. And my mom read that section and confiscated the magazine off us. So that'll kind of tell you how sort of protected I was around horror. It wasn't even that I wasn't allowed to play the games. It was I wasn't allowed to read reviews in a small section of a magazine on horror games that the rest of the magazine was covering, you know, platformers and shooters and what have you. So there was this kind of thing with me where horror always sort of was this forbidden fruit. And I guess that's kind of why I've been drawn to it a lot in sort of films as well. You know, my general genre within which I work, it tends to be horror. And yeah, I've got so many early memories of essentially playing things I shouldn't. And that really enhances the atmosphere and scares of a game. I very, very, very vividly remember when I was younger, we had just gotten a second TV in the living room for Christmas, and it was this small little CRT, because what was becoming a consistent problem for us is we only had the one TV, and I would just play games religiously, like, you know, from the very start of my day till night. Like I was not an extroverted social kid. I was very much a stay inside and play games from dusk till dawn. And as a result, you know, when my mom wanted to watch EastEnders, it was like, right, you have to come off your games. And at that point, I just didn't know what to do with myself. So I just ace and twiddle me thumbs and be extremely bored. But when we got this miracle, you know, CRT, and we tucked it away in the corner. So I had my own little corner to play games while she watched her soaps. And we went to this boot sale, and I picked up a big sort of, you remember those like CD wallets people used to have? And they would keep all the discs in the wallets. It was a very 90s thing. So I picked up this big CD wallet that, luckily for me, my mom hadn't noticed had a copy of Resident Evil in. Because she just flicked through the first lot, and it was like, oh, Crash Bandicoot, Spyro, yeah, you can have that. So I picked this up for a ridiculous price as well. It was so cheap. But that's boot sales for you, especially back in the day. And I was flicking through, and my mum was watching, you know, a soap opera on the TV, and I got the Resident Evil, and I saw that disc. Like, the disc to me is more evocative than the box art. You know, the disc where it has the eye and the people as the whole. Like that image in my head, that was like, oh my God, that to me was like finding a gun in my house, like just this completely taboo thing. And obviously I immediately had to play it, but I had to play it in a room where my very disapproving mother was currently watching her TV at the other side. So I remember just kind of like turning my CRT away and just sort of tucking myself into the corner, putting on like headphones and booting it up. And the game was terrifying to a, I guess, 9 or 10-year-old, or however old I was at the time anyway. But in that scenario where I knew I could be caught at any moment, just amped up the atmosphere loads. And the thing that got us, the thing that really got us in Resident Evil, it wasn't the spot that everybody else gets got by, and that's the dogs.
The dogs, yeah.
Everybody, you know, that's always their first, that was the first moment that jump scared us in a game.
Yeah.
For me, I'd done my research. I knew the dogs were coming. So I braced myself for the dogs. The bit that got us is just a little bit after that. There's a room with a statue, and you go into the back room, and there's a zombie on the floor. And you have to go past it and open the chest to grab, I believe, a key. And I was so sheltered from horror, it didn't occur to me that even though I knew what zombies were, the whole gimmick of, they could look dead, but they're not really dead. So I just assumed the zombie was set dressing, walked into it, and of course it grabs you and bites your ankle. When I tell you, I nearly died. My heart sunk into the pit of my stomach, and all I wanted to do was scream as loud as possible, but I couldn't because then I'd get in trouble. So all I did was I pressed pause, like instantly without even thinking, pressed pause and just white knuckle grip the PlayStation controller for the next 10 minutes as I just stayed there, unmoving, trying my very best to slow down my breathing and hoping to God that I didn't get caught playing Resident Evil.
That's awesome.
I've just got images of you, like, it reminded me of that episode of Simpsons where Homer has to stop swearing and he's like, twiddle-dee, that was painful. Like, really trying to hold it in.
It really was. Like, I literally, like, all my internal monologue was just for the next 10 minutes. But all anybody could see from the outside was a very, very still, very pale child. And if you would put your hand in my chest, the heartbeat would have knocked you back. Honestly, I was terrified.
I love that. You know what? You really reminded me there, and it was a kind of a realization for me as well. There was two types of children in the 90s. There was the child whose parents would shelter them and not let them play these games, and you would, in your case, make you become fascinated with the horror of it and the films, and just that as a whole genre and media. And then there's the other kids whose parents really don't give a crap if they watched an 18 or were running around playing Doom and Resident Evil and loaded for the PS1. And it's that kid who would lend the other kid those games.
Yeah. Oh, I got so many games that way by like sneaking into my older brother's room and stealing his when nobody was in, or borrowing from. Shout out to my secondary school friend Callum Patterson. Sorted us out in year 7 with a good few discs he did.
Fantastic. So Resident Evil, obviously completely iconic. Any other kind of like standouts for you? The 90s, I think for me, it is just like such a huge impact. But any other sort of like outstanding games for you that come to mind from that era that just terrified you and it just stuck with you?
From the era, there's like the 90s is a decade that I've actually really want to focus on in TerrorBytes, because for me, that is the decade that changed everything when it came to horror games. It didn't just introduce Resident Evil, but it also introduced Silent Hill, which is, Silent Hill 2 is personally, I think, probably the most perfect thing to ever exist. Like, I just think it is. Like, to say it's my favorite game would be underselling it. I literally think it is just the most perfect thing ever. I think it is a flawless work of art. And so obviously, we'll get the start of that franchise in the 90s, but then we'll also get all these hidden gems like Nightmare Creatures and Nightmare Creatures 2, which if you look back at the Nightmare Creatures 2 is really doing a lot of the things, obviously in a lot more janky PS1 lower budget way, but a lot of the things that, something like Bloodborne is doing now. It's got that really, Dark Souls it's got that really sort of weighty combat and like slow approaches to enemy encounters, everything you have to kind of like approach with like intent and deliberation. And it's got that really sort of,
it's got a turn-based
gothic
feel to it without being turn-based.
And it's got that really like gothic, almost Lovecraftian, but not quite horror to it, especially the second one. They're really like fascinating games that I think don't get enough of a look in for being something that I think you can still feel the DNA of to this day, even if it wasn't a direct line from Nightmare Creatures to Bloodborne. I do think there'll be middle points between those two games where something that inspired Bloodborne was, somebody on that dev team was a fan of Nightmare Creatures and pulled just a little bit from that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in terms of like games in general, if we don't fixate on the 90s, some of my favorite games of all time are horror games. I think there's a real indie revolution doing some incredible stuff right now. A game I really, really loved recently that nobody seems to have heard of or have played is Yuppie Psycho, which is this independent game by Baroque Decay, where you play as an office worker who shows up to this new job at this mega corporation. And it's this horror game, but it does really interesting things with its satire within like the way it sort of uses its horror to comment on like corporate culture and stuff, because the whole gimmick of the game is that you turn up to this office and it's this huge, huge, huge corporation and everybody is like working to death there, but nobody knows why they're there. Nobody knows what they're doing. And it's all about that kind of like office thing of like jobs that just exist just because, and having to do them and not really knowing what you're supposed to be doing or what you're contributing to and that. And it uses that as a kind of basis for this really surreal horror where you're sort of living in the ambiguity of that existence, but also that ambiguity is lending itself to the ambiguousness of the horror itself and the atmosphere that comes with that uncertainty. And and it's just got this really cool gimmick where you turn up to work and you don't know what you've been hired for, and then they tell you, oh, you're actually the resident witch hunter, and you have no idea what that means. Like, what do you mean I'm the witch hunter? What do you mean there's a witch in the building? And nobody kind of knows. And it's just really interesting what it does with it. And and if we think of horror a lot as well, and this is something we really want to explore in TerrorBytes, we think of horror a lot as well. When people say horror games, we think of Outlast, we think of Silent Hill, we think of Resident Evil, but it's just as important to think of, if I'm going to throw out another personal favorite of mine, and go back to the 90s again, Castlevania Symphony of the Night is one, and again, another one of the most perfect things to ever exist, but it is firmly a horror game. People don't think of it as a horror game. People think of it as an action game. And because it's got that Metroidvania label, people are very quick to sort of be like, oh, it's a Metroidvania game. But it's within its aesthetic, purely based in gothic horror.
Heavily inspired by the Hammer horror films as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the enemies and everything in there. Yeah, 100%. It's interesting because my next question to you was actually going to be, what video game do you think had the biggest significant impact on the genre of a whole, really?
Well, that's a tricky question. It's a good question, but it is a tricky one. And again, not to shamelessly plug, but this is sort of something we're going to kind of explore in TerrorBytes, because people really think that horror started with Resident Evil. And Resident Evil was such a formative piece within the subgenre, but it is by no means the beginning, not even close. This is a 50-year plus history. Yeah. You go back to the first survival horror game, and it's 3D Monster Maze, which is this black and white first person, like, it almost looks like ASCII art, and it is a survival horror in essence. It's literally just you navigate a maze while a dinosaur chases you, and surprisingly, still effective in its scares for being, 50 plus years old now. And so, you could sort of go, well, historically, I guess maybe it's 3D Monster Maze because that was the original horror game, or something like Haunted House on the Atari because that was the original, like, big commercial horror game. But did they make the same impact as something like Alone in the Dark? I don't think so. I would personally think that maybe it's Alone in the Dark. I know people would be very keen to say Resident Evil, but I don't think you have Resident Evil without Alone in the Dark. I think Alone in the Dark sets the template of so many features that we now associate as being integral to horror, and more specifically survival horror, which is kind of what we associate horror gaming with. So you look at Alone in the Dark and you get things like fixed camera perspectives. You get things like lack of combat ability, de-empowering the player, which is something like that very much goes against the grain of video games and only really works in the realm of horror a lot of the time. You also get the atmosphere, the visuals. It's sort of the first real foray into 3D there. And you get lots of things like the movement systems and stuff. And if you actually dig into the Resident Evil making of, the original Resident Evil is sort of a direct response to Alone in the Dark. Shinji Mikami, I believe it was Shinji Mikami on the team, played Alone in the Dark and was like, yes, this is what we need to do. Obviously, it was the much more commercially successful, platinum game that kind of really hit the sort of mainstream and became the sort of huge franchise that it is today. But I do think if I had to name the most influential horror game, I would probably say Alone in the Dark. And even then, it's very debatable.
Now, in terms of games that may be underrated, like, even though Alone in the Dark was a popular game, like you said, it might not get as much love as something like Resident Evil. I also remember around that time, I think between Alone in the Dark and Resident Evil, a game called Clock Tower, I remember playing as well.
Yeah, Clock Tower is fantastic.
Really
oh my God.
Remake.
Honestly, that actually, to go back to my favourite games, Clock Tower, original Clock Tower, I cannot believe I forgot about that when you asked sort of favourite horror game. That game, I played very late into its life cycle because obviously it didn't have an official English translation until, well, it technically doesn't yet. It's coming up later. So that was something I discovered sort of during the internet age as you kind of really, as I sort of came into my teens and sort of discovered, all of this like vivid history of the Super Famicom and stuff. And I remember getting a ROM of that and playing an English translated patch and thinking it was going to be an interesting element of history, but ultimately a kind of janky, sort of goofy, fun, like clearly trying to be scary, but in a way that's aged so poorly that it doesn't have that same effect anymore. Like you always hear these stories about how like people were terrified of the Daleks in Doctor Who when they first came up, but now
hiding behind the sofa,
and it's sort of like a comical thing now because they clearly have a whisk for an arm. I expected Clock Tower to be that because at the time I'm playing it, even then it's it's over a decade old, and it still, even within the limitations of the Super Famicom, even with 16-bit graphics, it is bizarrely atmospheric. It is incredible what they achieved through sound and visual in creating such an evocative atmosphere that it is still scary.
Music right now. I can literally
It's honestly, it's scarier than some of the games that came out in the genre on, well, now, I was going to say on PS2, but like even now, it is still holds up. It is fantastic game. And yes, I cannot wait for the remake.
Yeah, really looking forward to that.
I love some of the like psychological kind of horror games as well. I mean, that era seemed to spawn quite a few of them. There's I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream as well.
Yes.
So again, I mean, I don't know if you cover that in it as well, but that was definitely a bit of
it's in my trailer, actually. It very briefly appears in my trailer where she's just shaking the head while she's on the hook. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. Really, really fantastic. And I think perhaps this is a hot take, but I actually think maybe expanded and possibly even improved on the classic short story. Because if you read the source material, it's a very, very, very short story. But the visuals and atmosphere and character depth they added with the video game adaptation is like really quite impressive. They took something that was so brutally simplistic, this idea of this, supercomputer that is just has this hate for humanity and keeps these humans alive and just tortures them for the rest of eternity, really, really dark stuff. And you hear that concept and you're like, how the hell do you make a point and click adventure out of that? And then they did, and it was incredible. Like, another one sort of that really goes under the radar in terms of it, not as good as I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, I'll admit. It's a bit more like janky in the way it expects players to just kind of know things, which is very symptomatic of point and click adventures of the time. But H.R. Giga's point and click adventure Dark Seed.
Dark Seed, yeah.
Again, like really doing some incredible, interesting stuff with visuals and atmosphere within humongous limitations. And I think that's something that's so fascinating about horror as a subgenre within gaming. What I love about the subgenre, specifically within this medium, is how it communicates all these like vivid ideas and evokes such fear, but always through a layer of abstraction. You know, when you see a horror film, you're looking at people, you're looking at real people. And yes, we have got to a level that's close to photorealism with stuff like The Last of Us. But you look at indie games still coming out today with graphics that, you know, are reminiscent of like NES quality. Or if you look at something like Faith the Unholy Trinity, that's like, you know, that's mono graphics. That's like 2 pixel games, and creating such like evocative imagery out of those limitations is not just impressive, but like artistically interesting. Like it's something that could not be achieved in another medium.
Yeah.
We had Joe Biotero who did the artwork for Darkseid on the podcast recently, actually.
No way. That's brilliant.
Well, he was talking about how he kind of translated Giga's kind of artwork into essentially 16 colors, you know, to get them to run on like graphics cards of the day, and how that translated. But I think your imagination probably worked a bit harder as well to kind of compensate for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, horror is a genre within fiction and within storytelling that works best on imagination. You know, it's always scarier when the monster's in the dark than when the big rubber suit is kind of jerking around in front of the camera, in front of your face. You know, there's that whole horror, you know, rule of like, don't show too much of the monster. And I think what's interesting with games is that you can get away with showing so much because it always has that layer of abstraction where people fill in those blanks. So it's no matter how much you can kind of depict in the game, because of the limitations of the hardware you're working on or the artistic limitations you set yourself, you always have some room for the imagination of the player. And I don't think you get that in a medium like film or television.
Yeah, I mean, even text adventures can be scary. You know, it's like reading a book, I suppose, isn't
absolutely.
it?
Well, I mean, I played recently, it's sort of like a text adventure sort of, but kind of like a modernized twist. I played recently The House Abandoned, which is the first episode of a game that the name escapes me now, but it's got a very like Stranger Things aesthetic. But the whole gimmick with that is you play as somebody who goes into an attic and finds an old text adventure game. And your interface within this game is literally just that avatar's perspective looking at an old text adventure screen, you know, running MS-DOS. And you can see that the creators really understood the terror that can be pulled from that intimate setting of just a room in the dark with a quiet green glow illuminating your face as just text comes up on screen, because there are some absolutely thrilling segments. It's only a very, very short episode, but there's some really thrilling stuff in there that uses the literal limitation of we have a room and we have text on a screen, and still manages to make some of the scariest moments I've played recently. And I just think that's fascinating.
I just found that on Steam. £8.50. Yeah, so I'll give that a buy. Looks good.
There you go. Selling games.
Yeah.
So obviously horror, huge in terms of like artistic influence across the landscape of gaming and stuff like that. What kind of impact do you think the horror games, especially of the 80s and the 90s, do you think that's had kind of like in terms of gameplay and the mechanics and just the landscape of it across gaming overall? Do you think it's had a big impact on it? Do you think it changed the way we play and stuff at all?
I think hugely. I mean, I think if you look at like games like Dark Souls and Bloodborne and stuff, they are very much, you know, 1 foot in the horror grave, especially Bloodborne. And when you look at those games, they're essentially 3D Metroidvanias. And Metroidvania is a genre that doesn't necessarily need to be horror, but it's interesting that it keeps going back to that well, isn't it? You know, a lot of Metroidvanias use the kind of Castlevania aesthetic or the horror worlds of the horror sci-fi worlds of the
Last of
Metroid.
Us. Yeah.
Yeah, and we constantly revisit this well of this Metroidvania is not necessarily scary. You know, a lot of people think of horror as like it has to be scary, but that's not necessarily what horror is. Horror is dealing with like the darker themes and the creepy themes, and you can have something that's aesthetically horror without necessarily being scary. But we see this evolution of the Metroidvania, and that genre's foundations are built wholly on sort of the hallowed ground of horror, if you will. And then when you look at stuff like Resident Evil being, you know, the kind of knockout, multi-billion dollar at this point franchise that it is, and you trace it back to its sort of humble beginnings of those tank controls, fixed perspective camera angles. When you look at what it's evolved into, you know, with stuff like Resident Evil 4, where they sort of reinvented the survival horror genre again with the sort of over-the-shoulder third-person view, with all the remakes, they've kind of brought that back into Resident Evil 2, which originally was fixed perspective cameras. You can trace the line of evolution between those points. You know what I mean? Like, Resident Evil 7, on paper, looks nothing like Resident Evil 1. Because one is a first-person horror action game shooter.
Yeah.
If you can even call it a shooter, because it's not really a focus on shooter, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And then the other one is like resource management, isometric viewpoints, fixed camera perspectives, just aesthetically and functionally and mechanically totally different. And yet, when Resident Evil 7 came out, a lot of people gravitated to how much it felt like it captured the original feeling of Resident Evil before it had kind of gone down this action subgenre route with 5 and 6. And I think it's because they are still using the ingredients of what worked in those original games. You see in the stuff like resource management and bullet count come back. You see the stalker enemy, which is such a really cool feature that generally only exists within horror games, coming back again from, you know, Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 with Nemesis, and in Jack Baker with Resident Evil 7. And that's like a highlight of that game. But it's like you look at these high points and you look at these evolutions and you look at the way horror is done now, and like, even though it feels like a fresh new thing, it's like, there's that saying, you know, the more it changes, the more it stays the same. It's very much borrowing from the sort of secret ingredients that made it work in the first place.
I think you're spot on there. And I think I was, you know, I think that was a really, really good answer, because I'm thinking like, gameplay, kind of like control mechanics and stuff like that. But I enjoyed 7. But I never really kind of like related it back to 1 and 2 and thought about too much into the kind of like you say, the stalker enemy side of it and stuff like that with Jack. But that's a really, really interesting point, and has made me want to revisit that now, because
I love Resident Evil 7. It's such a great game. But
I didn't enjoy it as much as I did 8, funny enough. But
that's fair as well. Resident Evil 8 also fantastic. But when you look at the response to 7 and 8, like, I think the people who really gravitate towards early Resident Evil jump to those more than they do 5 and 6. Maybe not so much 4, because 4 still very much has a lot of horror in it with characters like the Regenerator. But 5 and 6 was the kind of period where the people who gravitated towards the horror of the games sort of switched off them a bit. And then 7 comes along, and in theory, it's less like the original games than 5 and 6 are, because 5 and 6 is still third person, but it evokes that feeling again that, you know, in terms of the setting as well. Obviously, Resident Evil 1 was very much all in the mansion. And Resident Evil 7 is all based around that house and then you go very to a small area outside of its house.
Yeah. No, you know, when you really get your brain thinking like that, number 1, you're in a mansion, and then you go to a cabin, then you go to a lab. 7, you're in a mansion, then you go to a cabin, and then you go to a boat, which is a lab. So it's really interesting when you think about those parallels and how it's still happening, you know, 20, 25 years later, and still prominent which is absolutely fantastic when you really
Yeah,
get your
and
brain
then
going.
if we look at other sort of ways it's influenced, we're seeing a real love and appreciation of things like tank controls kind of gain some momentum. Tank controls were always the thing that people criticized within horror games. It was always like, it became a thing. I can't remember what the game was, but I remember IGN sort of rolling their eyes at one point to be like, this game has tank controls. It became like, sort of a bad stamp, like a cross next to your name of like on the cons list, because people just didn't vibe with them at all because they're controlled so differently to how we traditionally move characters within games. But then it's really interesting because as horror games sort of moved away from tank controls but still had those fixed perspective angles, you started to see, oh, I get why they were tank controls. Because what happens is you move through one room into another room, the camera changes, you're still holding the direction you are traveling in on your control stick, and then suddenly your character just spins in place and goes back into the room that just came from. The tank controls was such a fundamental response in design to the game they were making. You know what I mean? Fair enough criticizing when Croc on PS1 has tank controls because it's a platformer. There's no need for that to have tank controls. But Resident Evil is inherently made with tank controls in mind. Yeah. And as we've kind of realized that as times went on and we've sort of had distance and time to appreciate it, we have gone back to that again. You're seeing a lot of return, especially in the indie scene, with things like Tormented Souls that are, again, sort of borrowing from the well of like the original Resident Evil games and those fixed perspective angles. And a lot of them are benefiting from tank controls, and people are happy to see tank controls. People like it when tank controls is an option within horror games when, before it was the black mark. And I think that's so interesting because it kind of draws parallels to when the analog stick first came out and everybody was like, what the hell is this? This is a mess, And then Mario 64 came along and everybody was like, oh, actually, this is pretty wild. This is pretty insane. But people really didn't like the analog stick at first. And it's kind of within the same sort of headspace, I think, where an audience sort of rejects an idea that in many ways is ahead of its time because they don't understand why it's like that. But then as time goes on, it becomes such a key part of what it was made for that we become nostalgic for it. And through that nostalgia, we understand its importance.
Yeah, and I think you even have to look at, indie games like, back in 1995 that were covered on this podcast, the Resident Evil HD remasters and, games like Babysitter Bloodbath will be another one I think we talked about as well. That kind of aesthetic, that PS1 kind of style and the tank controls, I think you're right. It's kind of at that age now where the nostalgia is kicking in.
Yes, and it's not just nostalgia as well. I think it's important to note that. I think when you look at games like game developers like Puppet Combo, who is making stuff like Babysitter Bloodbath and stuff
Murder
like
House.
that, and they're using Murder House and that they're using these kind of PS1 aesthetics. It's one part nostalgia. It's a very cool aesthetic to mimic nowadays because it's kind of had that 30-year life cycle where it's retro now. Yeah. And, you kind of see that a lot with things like indie projects like the Haunted PS1 disc, which is like all a collection of horror demos that are in the style of a demo disc for PS1, and they've all got those sort of PS1 graphics. But it's also, I think more importantly, a genuine aesthetic choice to evoke the horror they're intending. And it goes back to that abstraction. I do not think any of Puppet Combo's games are as scary if they have these wonderful photorealistic, Metal Gear Solid 3 remake aesthetics, because it removes something from them in the same way that like 70s films don't look right without the film grain. Like there's an earthiness and a natural texture to low poly graphics that really create these perfect abstractions within your head that allow for a player's imagination to flourish and really, really bring out the scares in it. It's sort of like, to draw a weird parallel, there's this analog horror film came out that's incredibly divisive recently called Skinamarink. And it's very, very divisive, and I totally understand why, because it is essentially 2 hours of empty rooms. Like that's the horror of it. But it's very grainy footage, and you're not quite sure what you're looking at. And one of the ways it achieves its horror is you sort of like leaning into the screen, being like, "Do I see a face there in the grain?" And you're never quite sure, because it's never a clear picture. And the PS1 aesthetic does that for games. You know, shadows don't quite look right, so you don't know if shadows are moving, and just things always have this kind of dingier look to them because they're not as polished, they're not as clean, and it creates a texture and an atmosphere that isn't achievable without those graphics. And you see time and time again that is definitely a factor, because there's indie developers not building in PS1 graphics. They're choosing to go even, you know, older with their aesthetics and evoke the Super Famicom or the, you know, even NES style graphics, or even, you know, like as far back as like Atari and Commodore 64 aesthetics. And they're finding the horror in those aesthetics. So it is both nostalgia, but it's also like in service of the greater goal of what they're trying to achieve.
You know, going back to kind of that era, that kind of pre-PlayStation era, I mean, obviously the arcades were huge then, and obviously arcades contributed to the horror genre as well. I mean, even games like, you know, Ghosts and Goblins and Ghouls and Ghosts. And
and House of the Dead is one of the key horror titles. And again, you know, if we're speaking of horror games influence, the influence of horror games is so massive it isn't limited to games. George Romero fully credited House of the Dead and Resident Evil as being the reason he was able to make zombie movies so late into his life, because it created a zombie renaissance and it made this big fascination. You look at things like, you know, the almost strange, overpowering zombie boom of the 2000s, where everything was zombies. In TV, you had Walking Dead. In movies, you had World War Z. In games, you had Left 4 Dead. It was just Dead Rising and Left 4 Dead 2, and there was just dead everywhere. That traces back to Resident Evil and House of the Dead. You know, they took what Romero originally made with Night of the Living Dead, they took that zombie myth, they put it into a new medium, and they gave it a second wind that blossomed and blossomed and blossomed and came to like this tremendous crescendo in the sort of mid to late 2000s.
I was just thinking it's a shame they couldn't make good films out of those franchises.
Yes. Oh my goodness. There were some terrible films, but it is interesting that the films exist. That's something, you know, like to come to the modern era. You look at something like Five Nights at Freddy's, and that making like, I think it's at like 178 million or something on its opening weekend. It made like over 100 million on its opening weekend against a 20 million budget. And that is an indie horror game, you know, made only 9 years ago with like really like simplistic gameplay. And the fact that can blossom into a bigger opening weekend than the Super Mario movie, when it also released in cinemas and on streaming at the same time, so people could have seen it for free and chose to go to the cinemas to see it, it shows that horror, especially as a subgenre within games, is really, really resonating in a really like key way with people that maybe other games aren't. You know, obviously we all love Zelda and Mario, and they have like massive fandoms, and we can never deny, you know, the impact of something even like Call of Duty or FIFA. But there is something about horror specifically that just really drives people mad. And you can blow up and just absolutely capture the imagination of the whole world with what's essentially a very lo-fi, almost walking sim level of interactivity with something like Iron Lung, which, if for those of you who aren't familiar, is an indie game where you only have the confines of a small submarine to work with, and you just have to take pictures at the bottom of the ocean, but it's very horror. And you know, that's getting a theatrical release and stuff. And it's those are the types of games that really fascinated me because you couldn't get them in any other genre. You know what I mean? You can only get these very specific games within this genre. I think if you'll allow us to go on like a little bit more of a tangent here, I think what's so incredible about the horror genre is how much it fits as a key piece within the gaming medium, but equally it is so oppositional to everything else around it. So traditionally with video games, we always think of them as being a bit of a power fantasy. You know, when you're Kratos, you are literally a god tearing other gods in two. When you're Master Chief, you are the universe's greatest soldier. When you are in playing Call of Duty, you know, you're the biggest action hero soldier that's ever existed in the US. And even if you go to something like Mario or Zelda, it is, you know, you are the warrior that slays Ganondorf at the end of the game, or you are the hero. You are this breezy, jump along, athletic gymnast. It's exciting, it's airy, it's dreamlike. And then horror is the only genre that comes around and goes, okay, but what if you were just a weird little dude? What if you were just like a lonely little man who's very sad?
With a crowbar.
Yeah. Like, I've played horror games where I am literally a lost little girl in Yomawari. I've played horror games where I'm a prisoner at the bottom of the ocean lying long. There's a new horror game that's came out recently called Cold Abyss, where you play as a man whose job it is to repair internet cables at the bottom of the ocean. What other genre is putting you in those roles? What other genre is literally de-empowering the player, putting you in the, you know, the average Joe shoes and saying, yeah, this is what we're going to explore?
It's that de-empowering, as you say, and it's funny because growing up, playing all these horror games on, you know, PS1, PS2, my best friend through school adored horror as a genre, but he couldn't play these games. He had to watch me play them because it was terrifying for him to be in that position. And, you know, I felt that so strange, but it was funny because the other way around for me is I found films scarier and the games maybe not necessarily scarier, but, you know, they would scare me more kind of thing. And I could get on with playing a game, and it's really interesting that. But before we wrap, let's talk a little bit more about TerrorBytes and just, you know, what we can kind of expect from that, because this has been an absolute love story to horror as a genre, not just for video games for me, but, you know, for films as well, talking to you about this, Dan. But what can we expect with TerrorBytes? What's the kind of inspiration behind the documentary? And just tell us what you can tell us about it at the moment, really.
Well, I think if it's not clear already, it's an absolute product of passion for it. You know, it is something that myself as producer deeply, deeply, deeply cares about. You know, we've got Richard Moss attached as writer. He's been on your podcast before on episode 303. For those of you who don't know him, he's a really accomplished games writer. He's written multiple books. He wrote The Secret History of Mac Gaming and Shareware Heroes. And he actually wrote and produced our other gaming documentary, FPS Doc. So, you know, he's very, very keen and well-researched on all topics relating to games. And, and horror has always kind of been the lifeblood of Creative EC. You know, In Search of Darkness is the flagship franchise. And to sort of bring this into the gaming world, what we really want to do is just paint this complete portrait of a genre that I think often goes misunderstood in a lot of different ways. You know, it can be through misconceptions, e.g. Resident Evil started horror, and it's like, well, that's just not true. Important, absolutely, but there's decades of history before that. Let's unearth that. Let's bring that into the spotlight, show people why it's important, why it matters, and see its evolution and how it acted as the foundations and the blueprints from which all of this stuff we love evolved. People think, you know, it's all blood and guts and violence, and it's like, well, actually, no, there's like real personal stories and narrative catharsis can be found in a lot of these games. It's not just about being scared and seeing some blood. People think that it's, you know, only Resident Evil and Silent Hill. And it's like, they are incredibly important games, and we will absolutely be exploring those key titles. But equally, you know, we want to talk about everything. We want to talk about this in such a huge scope. One of the most important horror games of all time is something that most people probably have never heard of, and that is a sound novel, a Japanese sound novel called Otogi Riso, which is for those of you who don't know, it kickstarted the sound novel genre, which is basically like a visual novel with even less graphical on-screen elements. And it did so much for games in that it introduced a lot of female players into a male-dominated environment at the time. It introduced a lot of like older players because, you know, people who were older maybe couldn't play Mario, but they could read a novel, and that's what this was. And it created so much tension and atmosphere that it was also, and this is the part that's really key to the horror history that a lot of people don't know, it was a direct influence on Silent Hill. It's just faded into obscurity because it is a Japanese-only sound novel, you know? And we want to talk about everything from the heaviest of heavy hitters to the really niche stuff and the obscure stuff that's maybe doing something really interesting or playing with the format in a compelling way. And then we want to talk about the vivid history that people have forgotten about. And I think it's so important, especially in this day and age, to have these discussions as we grow into a more digital focused environment, because we are already losing games and knowledge of these games to time.
Yeah.
And as that becomes digital, that's just going to increase. You know, the eShop for 3DS closed recently, and now there's no legal way to buy like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of games that were on that service. Things like Otogi Riso are getting lost down. Things like, you know, there was horror games on the 3DS that have just kind of disappeared into thin air. And we basically want to craft what would be to the viewer this vivid personal museum that will take them through this rich, vivid history, not just in a kind of pointed tour. You know, people aren't just on the bus at London and being like, if you look to your left, you'll see Big Ben. This is going to be a curated, just structured guide through this incredibly diverse medium and subgenre within this medium, and explored through the eyes of the developers, the composers, the writers, the voice actors, the fans. We're going to look at its impact on pop culture. We're going to look at how films informed horror games, and then how horror games informed films in return, and how it creates this Ouroboros of creativity where the snake's just eating its own tail and constantly evolving on itself. And we're just kind of going to pull this whole thing together in this really precise package that's going to explore every facet. You know, we could, in theory, just do 5 hours on survival horror alone, because there's enough content there, but we don't just want to cover survival horror. We want to talk about the things that people have forgotten about and really spotlight them and show why they're important. So we're talking things like the 90s FMV craze, where there was games like Harvester were coming out and causing loads of controversy because they used real life actors, and Night Trap. We're going to talk about the controversies as well. You know, horror has never been a genre that's been shy of controversies, and there's lots of that within the video game space. And we want to cultivate this huge, just monumental documentary that somebody who loves horror games will get a lot out of, but equally somebody who knows nothing about them will thoroughly enjoy and understand why these games are important and come out the end knowing a hell of a lot about them. And that's kind of our goal. And we know that there's a real desire for this. You know, there's lots of really great YouTubers out there now doing like deep dive video essays into all these individual games, and they're doing, you know, what they're doing is great, and like they're really archiving the same stuff we want to. But with them, and, you know, no disrespect to YouTube as I am on myself, you know, they tend to be a lot, obviously, lower budget. It tends to be like 1 or 2 people working on these projects, and they are doing it on a very specific scope or a very specific section of a game or just a one franchise. And then we kind of want to take those ideas and concepts and just blow it up into a scale that's never been seen before with, you know, touching base with like the people who made it and made this whole sort of horror revolution happen. Because it is a revolution. Like, this is what's really, really exciting about horror games is, yes, it has a 50+ year history, but a lot of the early bits of that history have these significant gaps in. And so what we're finding with horror games is we're entering a golden age right now, and it's really blowing up. And this is its infancy stage. This is just the part where you need to start documenting these things so that you've got this specific artifact you can point to and go, that's where this all began. And yeah, that's the goal. And everybody we sort of spoke to about it so far, you know, we're talking to a lot of people. I can't name names, but people are excited about this. People are excited to be involved. We've talked to developers, we've talked to YouTubers, we've talked to filmmakers, we've talked to, you know, people within the horror space, academics, journalists, and everybody's really, really excited for it. I mean, it was actually some of that excitement that got me onto the podcast today. I reached out to my filmmaker friend Ninian Doth, who made Get Juked, which is a film you can watch now on Amazon Prime. Recently got parodied by The Simpsons, as it happens. And yeah, he was, you know, thrilled. And without me even trying to, you know, reach out to you guys, he passed it on to somebody who passed it on to somebody who passed it on to somebody who passed it your way. And it's that buzz is something we're really excited about, because it's like, oh, okay, people want this and they need this. And we think, and we hope, because we think horror games are important, that this guide and, you know, curated museum to them is hopefully going to be very important too.
Well, Dan, it sounds incredible. I'm sure everyone listening is, you know, chomping at the bit to watch this movie, and obviously still in production at the moment. You kind of touched on there, you know, people that you were talking to. Is there kind of any famous names who are going to be interviewed? Because I know previously there've been some very high-profile guests in the documentaries from BC. And also, how far along is it, and when can we expect a release date?
So we'll be looking at pre-sale early next year. I can't give any exact dates yet, but we'll be looking around February. Production, I wouldn't want to give exact dates out, but we'll expect to be, you know, kind of in production of this for between 1 to 2 years. But yeah, that would be what window where you want to be looking out for it would be sort of early next year, as we kind of bring up the pre-sale campaign. And you can follow us on that with, if you go to creativec.com, we are in the projects panel that we have on the website, or if you want to go straight there, you can go to creativec.com/TerrorBytes. What's really helpful actually is on there is a survey. We have been reading every single response we've got. So all it is it's a survey that sort of asks you, you know, who do you follow in horror game communities? Who would you like to see? What aspects of horror in gaming interest you? It's a really short survey, but everybody who's doing it is genuinely having a direct effect on the doc. I would really encourage all of your listeners to fill out that survey. It's incredibly helpful to us because we will do all of the research we can in the world. But, you know, we are one team, and to be able to reach out to the massive fandom that is the horror gaming fandom, who are going to have all sorts of obscure knowledge that some, like, we couldn't even uncover through research, to hear from those. And also, you know, even if you don't have that obscure knowledge, if you just really want to know about Resident Evil and Silent Hill, let us know. That's super helpful to us. And you will have a direct effect on the documentary, and you could, in fact, inform this, what we hope will be this significant part of horror gaming history. And yeah, so the dates to look out for are sort of February, early next year. Not an exact date yet, but That's kind of the month to watch, sort of late January, early February. And if you want to stay up to date with everything that's developing, you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. On all of those, we are just TerrorBytes Doc. And if you fill in the survey, we'll keep you up to date on when it all goes out and what's happening. And you'll see new trailers as they come out, because that's not going to be the only trailer. Lots of cool stuff still to come. And you can get in at ground zero and, grab yourself a bunch of merch when it all happens, and it'll be really, really cool. In terms of big names that are in it, like I say, I can't name names exactly yet, but for those of you who aren't familiar with our previous work, we did In Search of Darkness, and that featured people like John Carpenter, who created Halloween and The Thing. We did FPS Doc with people like John Romero and John Carmack, who created Doom. So without saying exactly who's in, you can kind of get a sense of our scope and our scale and the kind of people we contact from our previous documentaries. But other than that, I have to remain tight-lipped, I'm afraid.
No, fair enough. I'm sure, like you said, based on your track record, it'll be some big names from the industry, and it'll be, a real love letter to the genre. So, Dan, we wish you all the best with it. Obviously, I'll link it up in our show notes as well. People should go and check out the teaser, fill in that survey, and if you're a fan of horror gaming, let the guys know what you want to see in there. And we can't wait to see it. Thank you so much for coming on and reminiscing with us as well, Dan. It's been great to talk to you.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I could do this all day. I just love geeking out about horror games.